Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us today for the 7th annual meeting of the Innovation for Cool Earth Forum, hosted by Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and New Energy and Industrial Technology Development Organization. During this session, we'll be accepting questions from all of you. To ask questions, simply go to the question submission area toward the bottom of your screen or access the question submission page from the program menu. We look forward to receiving your questions. And now we will start the session of Roadmap Project. First, I would like to introduce the moderator of this session, Mr. David Sandalow. Mr. Sandalow is inaugural fellow of Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University and co-director of Energy and Environment Concentration School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University. The speakers for this session are Dr. Colin McCormick, Adjunct Associate Professor of Science, Technology, and International Affairs, Walsh School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University. Professor Daniel Sanchez, Assistant Specialist of Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management, University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Roger Aines, Energy Program Chief Scientist for Global Security E-Program, Energy and Homeland Security, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Dr. Julio Friedmann, Senior Research Scholar of Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. And we invite Dr. Holly Buck, Assistant Professor of Environment and Sustainability, College of Arts and Sciences, University at Buffalo, New York, as a discussant. And now I would like to ask Dr. Sandalow to moderate this session. Dr. Sandalow, if you please.
Thank you so much. Good morning in Tokyo, good afternoon and good evening around the world. Congratulations to all the organizers of the ICEF conference. It's really been amazing dialogue so far and under very challenging circumstances, but it's great to be able to meet here remotely. And tonight, it's our honor to present to you the work done this year on the ICEF roadmap. And we have the co-authors of the roadmap and a distinguished professor to comment on this field. And so let's just get started with it. Why don't we pull up the first slide, please? This year's ICEF Innovation Roadmap is on the topic of biomass carbon removal and storage. Next slide, please. We started out this project about 9 months ago to write a roadmap on the topic of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. That's a term that is probably familiar to many people who work on climate policy. BECCS has been part of the climate dialogue for decades, and it plays integrated assessment models that chart paths towards deep decarbonization. But as we did our research, we concluded that first of all, biomass can be used to capture and store carbon dioxide without energy production. And second, that carbon removal value of biomass may often exceed its energy value. And for those two reasons, we thought the terminology of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage didn't really tell the full story. Next. And therefore, we are proposing in this ICEF roadmap a new term. It's called biomass carbon removal and storage. And we think that places the emphasis in a better way than the old term of BECCS. In English, that would be BICRS or BICRS. So this is the new term that we propose to replace BECCS with. Next slide, please. Our research also revealed that using biomass for carbon capture and storage creates risks, some serious risks, adverse impacts on food security, on rural livelihoods, on ecosystems. And furthermore, that that the CO2 benefits of using biomass can actually be offset or even eliminated by indirect land use changes. These are very serious issues, and they're not technical issues, but they're social, operational, and policy issues that demand very serious attention. Next slide, please. So in our roadmap, we propose 3 guiding principles for BICRS. The first is do no harm. Projects in this area should not, in order to mitigate climate change, they should not hurt biodiversity or food security or livelihoods. Second principle is social acceptability is key, and our third principle is technology development should reflect social priorities. Next slide, please. So we define BICRS as a process that has 3 components. It uses biomass to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. It stores CO2 underground or in long-lived products. And it does no damage to, and ideally it promotes, food security, rural livelihoods, biodiversity conservation, and other important values. Next slide, please. Here's our table of contents. I won't go through every chapter. Next slide, please. You can download the roadmap in full from the ICEF website. We invite you to do that. We're accepting comments all month, and then we will revise the roadmap based upon comments received by the end of the month for final release in December. And with that, next slide, please. And I will turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Julio Friedmann.
Thank you, David. And thank you, ICEF, for the opportunity to present this work and to take it on. I wish I was in the Hotel Chinzanso with you all. These are the key messages of our roadmap. First, BICRS is a gigaton pathway. We believe that in a sustainable way, one can remove between 2.5 and 5 billion tons each year using BICRS approaches, and that can scale up to that level by mid-century. The second key message, the biggest issues with this technology pathway are not technical. There certainly are technical issues, and we spend some time exploring them in the roadmap. The key issues with BICRS are institutional and political, whether it is done well and whether it is accepted. The third key message, there is enough waste today to begin at a large scale. Agricultural wastes, municipal wastes, forestry wastes are a good initial biomass source. Over time, we believe that algae can be important, both microalgae and macroalgae, things like seaweed and kelp. Fourth message, if one uses a dedicated energy crop like timber or a food crop or miscanthus, that creates risks with respect to other domains that are important, such as food security, biodiversity, and people's livelihoods. So we have done most of our analysis focused on wastes and being cautious about these other dimensions. Next slide, please. If this is going to be a gigaton solution, and if this will be widespread, it must be sustainable, and that requires sustainability standards. These standards must be transparent and widely applicable in order for BICRS to succeed in its mission. Sixth, there are technologies available today to develop those standards. The ability to monitor biomass as it is grown, harvested, transported, and converted is extraordinary and getting better every year. That will help ensure good practices. Finally, as David mentioned, we recommend a core principle: do no harm. This will only succeed if it's widely accepted, and if it creates more problems than it solves, that is not a solution. Next slide, please. Next, please. It's important to know that there are substantial operating facilities today. The biggest of these, Archer Daniels Midland in Illinois, captures 1 million tons of CO2 each year. The largest proposed facility is in the United Kingdom. That's the Drax plant. If fully operational, that will be 16 million tons a year. To get to that larger scale, we need to increase by a factor of 1,000 or 2,000 to reach the volumes we need. The facilities that exist today combine carbon capture and storage with either combustion or fermentation to make fuels or gasification. There are other pathways as well. For example, pyrolysis of woody biomass products to make bio-oils. One can capture the CO2 from that or sequester the bio-oil directly. One can also make products like biochar or carbon fibers that are entombed in long-lived products. Next slide, please. These new pathways are only beginning to be explored, and we spent some time emphasizing the need for more research in all these pathways. One example of these beyond biochar is to make wood products that go into construction. Another interesting new option is to convert biomass directly to a liquid which can be injected into the subsurface, just like CO2 into oil fields or saline formations. Another pathway is to grow algae in the ocean and then sink it directly to the abyssal plain. And there's important new technologies that make that more attractive than initially thought. This is a domain of important future research, and we recommend it in the roadmap. Next slide. A key finding, and this is counterintuitive to many here today, is that the carbon removal value may exceed the energy value. And the main reason why this is that biomass has a lot of carbon and not a lot of energy. So this example of this chart shows the carbon removal value for different kinds of fuels, where if you substituted for coal or gas or oil, what the value of that would be in terms of energy or carbon tonnage. The blue slanted line shows the value of carbon removal at different carbon prices. And effectively, even at fairly modest values, $50, $80, the carbon value of removal may be higher than the energy value of substitution. This is part of the reason we pursued BICRS as a topic as opposed to BECCS. Next slide. This has led us to create this new term, and we think that BECCS is a subset of BICRS, and we hope to see the literature replace BECCS with BICRS as a term and as a mental framework. With that, I am happy to turn the presentation over to Dr. Daniel Sanchez at Berkeley. Next slide, please.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Daniel Sanchez. I'm a faculty member at UC Berkeley, and it's a real pleasure today to speak with you about this work on biomass carbon removal and storage, or BICRS for short. I'd like to start by offering some comments around why we are pursuing carbon dioxide removal and why we are so excited about the use of biomass to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Next slide. I want to start by emphasizing that technologies that remove carbon from the atmosphere and permanently draw down that carbon or sequester that carbon out of the atmosphere is essential for meeting our climate goals. We think of carbon removal approaches, again, which remove CO2 from the air, as being additional or complementary to conventional climate change mitigation approaches, things like energy efficiency or renewable energy, or carbon capture and sequestration applied to fossil energy. And it's important to note that carbon removal is going to be essential for stringent climate change mitigation. For instance, all pathways modeled by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that are consistent with a global temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius or less deploy on the order of hundreds to thousands of billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal through the end of the century. And this is important to keep for global ambition to limit climate change and to embrace stringent climate change mitigation. Next slide. Now, there are numerous approaches to carbon dioxide removal. This slide was actually in a prior roadmap from direct air capture for the ICEF roadmap in 2018. And there are two broad approaches to removing carbon from the atmosphere. The first is to use biology or plants, which grow and suck CO2 out of the air. And the other are to use chemistry or chemical approaches to pull CO2 directly from the atmosphere. We think that bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, or BICRS, is particularly interesting because it involves management not only of plants and biomass and the terrestrial biosphere, but also advanced engineering and advanced chemistry to make products from that biomass. Many of those products store carbon and provide a climate benefit. Next slide. And as I mentioned before, and as we mentioned before, because biomass and carbon removal involves using the land sector, involves using plants, we have to consider all of the other contexts for which we rely on the land for around the world. We rely on land for food production and food security. We rely on it for rural livelihoods and rural economic development. And we rely on it for biodiversity and other ecosystem services. Again, the social context related to biomass cultivation, harvesting, and transportation are extremely important to whether or not BICRS is a sustainable and scalable carbon removal technology. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Colin McCormick, my colleague from Georgetown University.
Thank you, Dan. Next slide, please. So there are many potential types of biomass feedstocks for BICRS. Waste biomass is generally the best because it minimizes impacts on food production, and it can come from many sources. Dedicated crops could be used in limited amounts, but dedicated energy crops may turn out not to be optimal for BICRS. We believe this is an area that deserves further research. Some feedstock could come from managed forests and micro and macroalgae with further research and scale up. Next slide, please. We developed an estimate of the global technical potential for BICRS. This was based on estimates of biomass availability for biofuels. The most credible of those estimates is that a maximum of 5.5 gigatons of oven-dry biomass could be available by 2050. We next asked the question, how much carbon dioxide could be captured and stored for each of those tons of biomass? This is different for different conversion pathways, and we discussed that in the report. So using those conversions, we conclude that between 2.5 and 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide could be captured and stored via BICRS processes. This agrees with a similar estimate of the global technical potential for BECCS that was developed by the US National Academy of Sciences. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So one reason that BICRS is interesting is that it offers lots of different kinds of configurations. One could move biomass feedstock to conversion facilities. One could move those products, such as ammonia or hydrogen, or one could move carbon dioxide. That provides a lot of options, and understanding them requires understanding transportation. Today, there are two main types of processed biomass that are transported globally. Wood pellets are traded at over 20 million tons a year, and exports are dominated by North America, with imports dominated by Europe and growth in Asia. Next slide, please. The second is bioethanol. Approximately 17 billion liters are traded per year. The US and Brazil dominate these exports, and imports are more broadly spread. Understanding these trade patterns and the infrastructure behind them helps us understand the potential and the need for transporting biomass versus other approaches to BICRS configurations. So now I'll hand it over to Dr. Roger Aines.
Thank you, Dr. McCormick. All of this carbon dioxide that we want to remove from the atmosphere has to go somewhere. Next slide, please. And the most important aspect of that is to put it underground, because geologic storage is available today, and we know that we can put large amounts there. So the geography of where this geologic storage is, as Colin mentioned, will be very important. Do you store the CO2 near where it's developed, or do you process it somewhere remotely? This is an important thing to evaluate. Next slide, please. These geologies are available all over the world, and understanding the linkage between where the biomass is and where the geologic storage is will be an important aspect. Next slide, please. The second area that can be used for long-term storage is to turn the biomass into long-lived products. We've all heard of biochar, which may have lifetimes as much as 1,000 years in the soil, but other things are important. Engineered wood products, bioplastics, biofiber, and concrete all may have lifetimes that are long enough to constitute a real removal from the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So with all of these research items in mind, our goal is now to turn this into a research agenda. What do we need to do in order to make this a reality? Next slide. We'll cover 4 major topics here. Next slide, please. In technology development, the areas emphasize the large-scale development of things like hydrogen from biomass, which is already capable of being done at small scale, but we need to develop these systems and the supply chains to do it at large scale. The new pathways that we mentioned are going to be an important research area, because developing biochar, engineered wood, direct storage are all things that are done at a very small scale today and need to be developed. There needs to be a lot of research to make those reality. Pyrolysis is an important technique that's used to process biomass today, but it's not done at large scale, and doing it at a scale large enough to actually impact liquid transportation fuels is going to be an important development phase. Satellite monitoring is going to be critical for understanding whether the suppliers of biomass are actually complying with what they said they would do in order to meet their obligations under the sustainability aspects of their agreements. And finally, plant breeding, we think, is going to be important to improve the soil, because the plants that we use for these biomass options are interacting with the soil, and we can be storing carbon in the soil while we're using biomass to supply the carbon. Next slide, please. But the most important new area for research here in BICRS is around the social aspects of the undertaking. We talked about the fact that the technical are not the largest impediments, but social sciences clearly are. Who controls the biomass? Who benefits from the value that's derived here? And where are those benefits found? Are they found in the country that grows the biomass, in the country that processes it, or in the country that stores the CO2? There are opportunities for local communities. There are risks for local communities. These need to be resolved, and this is a big research topic. Next slide, please. We discussed in the roadmap that there are a lot of interactions that need to be developed here, and this is brand new research. This is an area where the nations that are interested in this are going to have to encourage this kind of research in order to understand this and to do a good job on making sure we make good on making this something that is useful for everyone who participates. Next slide, please. Finally, this is a truly integrated process around the world. We're talking about growing biomass around the world, processing it in many places, storing CO2, or building new products that can transport other places. It's going to engage social, economic, and environmental issues. This is perhaps the most integrated of the climate technology issues that we deal with. And with that, I will turn it back to Colin to talk about satellite monitoring.
Thank you. Next slide, please. It will be very important to ensure that the production of biomass for BICRS does not lead to damaging land use change, such as deforestation. Fortunately, there are a number of existing satellites that can monitor land use change in near real time, such as the Japanese ALOS-2 radar satellite. It will be important for governments to continue to support these flagship satellite missions. Governments should share this data openly, and they should also use this and other monitoring techniques to ensure that biomass production for BICRS does not adversely affect ecosystems. So now I'll hand it back to David Sandalow.
Thank you, Colin. Next slide, please. And the next slide. We're just about at the end of our presentation here, but I want to speak for a moment about a very important chapter of our report, which is on policy. And this agenda is not going to move forward without supportive policies. We talk about three categories of policies. One of them is incentives for removing carbon from the atmosphere with tools like emissions trading, tax policy, and mandates. A second category is support for research and development, which is going to be absolutely essential. And then a third very important category is standard setting. And we think without standards set first in local and national contexts and then internationally, this agenda cannot move forward in a way that meets the principles that we set out. And the standards are going to need to address measurement, reporting, verification, accounting life cycle emissions, timeframes, and leakage. And we propose that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change launch a BICRS platform modeled after the RED Plus platform that's been a very useful venue for dialogue on reducing emissions from deforestation. Next slide, please. So our findings and recommendations are, next slide, please. We provide in the roadmap, I won't get into the details here, but we provide a roadmap figure, which as you can see, looks at the near term, the medium term, and the long term in several different categories. First, policy standards and science, logistics and transport. And then next slide, please. And then in feedstocks and technology. And we invite you to kind of work through each one of these boxes and see the sequences that we have in mind for how this whole sector of BICRS could develop over the years. Next slide, please. So here are our key messages, just to summarize. Biomass carbon removal and storage could deliver 2.5 to 5 gigatons per year of CO2 removal and storage by mid-century. It's making a real contribution to reaching net zero emissions. The biggest issues are institutional and political, not technical. Wastes are attractive as initial biomass sources. Using timber or dedicated energy crops for carbon removal and storage creates risks with respect to a number of important values, including food security, rural livelihoods, and biodiversity conservation. Next slide, please. Widespread adoption of sustainable biomass standards are going to be needed to address these risks. We think technologies are available to monitor biomass production and help ensure good practices, and we recommend a core principle: do no harm. Next slide, please. And so that summarizes the content of our roadmap. We invite you to download it. Just to repeat, we are collecting comments by email, the email address in the roadmap. We're collecting comments by email all month. We're going to take any and all comments received from around the world and produce a final roadmap for release in December. And I want to thank once again Mehdi and Nito and the whole ICEF conference for their support in helping to produce this roadmap. And now I'm just delighted to turn the floor over to one of the leading experts in this topic, Professor Holly Buck, who's a professor in the Department of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Buffalo. She's also author of a widely read and discussed book called After Geoengineering. Holly, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you all and to discuss the social dimensions of this roadmap. And I'd like to start out with a very brief characterization of the existing social science research on this. Next slide, please. there's been a moderate amount of social science research that relates to BICRS, getting used to it. It tends to depart from research on BECCS. So research on BECCS, for example, tends to examine component parts. There's social science that relates to biofuels, to carbon capture and storage, but not to the whole unit. And the research also tends to be focused on questions of public acceptance and social license in particular communities. It's also focused on identifying and avoiding social risks, but it tends to be an add-on research that's not really integrated with the biophysical science. And so I'm encouraged that it's increasingly acknowledged that we need social science research on carbon removal broadly and on BICRS. But what sort of social science research do we need? I think that we need social science that can take a systems perspective, that is multi-scalar, that identifies and works towards opportunities for community benefit, and that is truly integrative during the formation of the research and the research design, not in a siloed area. And so I'd like to elaborate a bit more on those aspects. Next slide, please. In terms of a systems approach, there's a few dimensions. So one aspect is that BECCS for net negative emissions in particular implies more widespread social change because it interacts with other systems that will need to be decarbonized. So it's nested within these systems. The research that we need doesn't need to just integrate disciplines or sectors, but also the very systems themselves: waste removal and processing, forestry, energy, water, food systems, etc. Next slide, please. We also need social science research that is multi-scalar. A lot of research thinks about the social in terms of being impacts in particular places, in terms of being local. But it's really more complex than that, because in the globalized system that we have, the social impacts are telecoupled with places that are far away, and they extend beyond these sites of production or injection or consumption. And many of the impacts that are experienced on the local scale are only addressable on regional, national, or even global governance scales. Next slide, please. So we also need research that is multi-scalar in terms of these scales throughout the chain, from farm to underground, from forest to underground, from municipal waste to underground, from the algae ponds to underground, or from the oceans to underground, or products or building materials. This is a lot more complex than what we've been examining to date. And it's important because failing to understand just one of these steps, if we miss the social aspects of one of those steps, it will reverberate throughout the whole chain. Next slide, please. Finally, questions about the global scale will come up anytime you're working with communities, with people, right? Particularly about how BECCS and other forms of carbon removal relate to broader climate policy goals. And some of the big questions that people have are, is carbon removal going to slow energy on mitigation? How will it interact with adaptation? And we need to not be afraid of these questions, but treat them as learning opportunities to better understand the socio-political systems that we are in. And everybody asking these questions, they're not threats to carbon removal. They're potential allies that we can work with to develop the most robust version of these technologies that we can get. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to close with a word about environmental justice, which is a concept that's increasingly of interest to communities. I think globally, it's become a global field of research and a global movement. And it's a multidimensional field and movement. So these are the types of questions that we want to be asking if we want to go just beyond social license and social acceptability. We need to look at these procedural dimensions about our communities at the table in the design phase. How can they participate and direct the development of these technologies? Distributive implications in terms of who bears the harms and reaps the benefits. I think that this roadmap is already calling out that, but now we have to figure out how to operationalize identifying those risks and actually addressing them. Reparative, so how can negative emissions repair some of the harms that have been done by carbon pollution? Intergenerational, thinking about what obligations developments of particular infrastructures or industries are placing on future generations, and what the failure to do those is doing to future generations. And finally, this recognitive dimension. So do policies and projects for BICRS recognize the values, cultures, histories of the places and peoples that they affect? And so thank you again for the opportunity to comment, and I look forward to our discussions.
Professor Buck, thank you so much for joining us and for those very interesting comments. And we have a number of questions coming in, and please, if you have more, don't hesitate to send them. We have a question about algae, which is a topic we discuss some in the roadmap. And the question is, how do you see the possibility of algae being combined with carbon capture and storage? I might start with Colin McCormick. Is that something that you've looked at that you'd like to comment on, Colin?
I have a piece to say on that. Microalgae, which is generally grown on land in reactors. And excuse me, I'll stop my video to see if that helps. And macroalgae, which is grown in the oceans and could be thought of as seaweed. Microalgae has received more attention, although macroalgae, I think, is growing as a possible biomass feedstock. There are many issues with treating it. It needs to be dewatered. There are salt issues. So it potentially could serve as an important feedstock source in the future, but there are many challenges remaining before it can really scale.
Any other thoughts from anyone? Julio, do you have any thoughts on algae?
Yes. There are a couple of issues that Colin mentioned already: drying, which is expensive, dealing with the salt, which is expensive. There's also life cycle of harvesting. And last but not least, it's expensive. We're looking at something like $1,200 a ton for microalgae. It's part of the reason we are interested in thinking about macroalgae direct to the deep ocean, because all of those problems go away. There's no product, there's no energy, but the carbon goes down and stays down.
Does anyone have more comments on macroalgae? Because obviously that is a topic that could be of considerable interest in Japan as an island nation. Do we have any thoughts on the research agenda for macroalgae?
I'd like to comment that one of the most important issues around BICRS is land use and land use change. And so one of the research issues that has to be resolved is if we're going to use ocean-based algae production at large scale, are we doing so in a way that's environmentally appropriate? However, certainly in Asia, that is done at large scale today, and so that looks like something that is ready to go.
I suppose, are there risks of, we have depleted fisheries as a result of heavy fishing? Could we imagine a world in which we do the same thing to algae? We need to be careful as we proceed with this, yeah?
That's exactly why it's a good research topic.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, one of the questions that comes up is macronutrient transfer.
Yep.
That you may harvest a bunch of nitrogen and phosphorus from the surface oceans, and that this may be transferred to the deep. We won't know until we do some research.
Great. Well, we have a question on coal-fired power plants. One of our listeners says coal-fired power plants with CCS function with biomass co-firing, and they can create negative emissions. Should this be pursued? Something you know a little bit about, Julio. Would you like to offer any thoughts on that?
I do, and then I'll hand off to Colin and Dan Sanchez, who also know quite a lot about this. This is the basic idea of the Drax plant. They took a coal plant and began replacing the coal with biomass, and now want to do carbon capture and storage. So from a technical perspective, we know this works. There have been pilots done in many countries, again, blending different amounts of biomass. So from a technical perspective, we know this works. It looks increasingly like this is a reasonable economic option as well, that the costs are not so bad. And again, in the UK, they have a policy which is a contract for differences, which is proposed to pay for that price difference. The key issue that we realized in this is not a technical one. We know we can do it. We think the costs are okay and the costs will improve. The key issue is if you want to replace biomass at a large scale and harvest it and transport it to coal plants, then that becomes a social and political issue.
On top of that, I think that the foundational research that we have pursued around the thermochemical conversion of things like coal, but also biomass, is tremendously important for the future in which we are using biomass to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So from a research perspective, I see coal and biomass and really the using of heat and catalysts to convert solid carbonaceous compounds into products as absolutely something that should be pursued and can be pursued both through coal and through biomass. I'm not sure that we will end up converting both these facilities or both of these products together in the same facility. We might have a more modular and decentralized deployment that focuses entirely on biomass, depending on the policy framework that we use to support carbon removal.
One last thought on this. Japan has begun to experiment with blending ammonia into its coal plants as a pathway of decarbonizing. And Roger had mentioned the idea of making carbon negative hydrogen from biomass, which should allow you to make carbon negative ammonia. This is one of these things to explore. Right now, we know we can do 20%. We're beginning to blend up to 50%. But the question becomes, how can you make the hydrogen and how do you do it well?
Maybe we'll come back to this questions around conversion processes, which we didn't really get to in the presentation, but we talk about in the roadmap. But we could come back to that. Any other thoughts on this coal plant? Colin, were you about to come in?
Yes, one brief comment. I think it's important to note that in the current configuration of the wood pellet market, there are environmental impacts that occur where the wood is harvested and pelletized. And in a sense, the buyer is buying the biomass product, but the environmental consequences stay back in the country of production. And this is the sort of scenario that needs to be very carefully thought through on a systems level to ensure that CO2 reduction in one country does not lead to environmental degradation in another country.
Key point. We have a very interesting question from our chairman, from the chairman of ICEF, Mr. Nobuo Tanaka, who asks, is there a specific role for women in biomass carbon removal and storage? I have to give Nobuo credit. He has pushed gender equality as a central theme of the ICEF conference this year and last year. So thank you, Nobuo, for that and for your question. And Holly, I guess you are the logical person to answer offer any thoughts on this. What, and maybe just to broaden it with within biomass and even climate mitigation broadly. Any thoughts on women's role?
I've actually been thinking a lot about this lately because we need to both make sure to avoid added burdens, because we know that in a lot of places, agricultural and labor that deals with biomass can be very gendered, and we don't want to add to the burden of women, but we also want to make sure that the opportunities are equally distributed. So, and that involves not just repeating or extending what we have now. For example, carbon capture and storage is a very gendered field of employment. And if you go to some communities that are engaged with where you would want to inject CCS, thinking about in particular communities in Texas, where there's a lot of carbon dioxide injection for enhanced oil recovery. These are very stratified communities because the men are working with carbon management jobs and the women are working in very low paid service industries, if they're working at all. And we don't want to replicate that. So I think that if I was a funder, I would really be thinking about how to build up a diverse pipeline of talent, because this is going to take decades. And so we need to be investing in young women researchers, people of color, in their education and their early career opportunities, so that they can really lead this field going forward. Not to put it as a problem for the future, but that's one thing I think we can do to shift things.
Amen. My view is we need a revolution here in order to solve this problem. If you're going to have a revolution, we better do it with all of humanity, not half of humanity, and find ways to break down the barriers that prevent half of humanity from being fully engaged. And then, as you were saying as well, the also facing disproportionate burdens as a result of the impact of climate change in many, many places. Is this, I'm curious, Holly, is this, do you think enough attention is being paid to this in research around the world today? And any thoughts about how we could get more attention paid to these issues?
I think in general, there is, a sustained stream of attention, especially with the, gender equality being one of the sustainable development goals, since at least the 80s, thinking about differential impacts. But what we're not doing, we need more of that, and we also need to think a lot more about identifying opportunities and equalizing those opportunities. And that touches so many of the sectors that were discussed in your roadmap, from the monitoring to the carbon optimized plants. All of these technical sectors are still highly gendered. So it's really a whole of society project that, if we can get it working for all of society, it will also touch carbon removal.
Other thoughts? Holly, I wanted to stick with you because your presentation was so interesting, and just ask about the research that you say is needed. And I wonder if you could say, are the main barriers financial, do you think, at this point? Do we just need more funding for research in this area? Does this relate to promotions and different institutions? What's it going to take to get the type of research you think needs to be done completed in the years ahead?
I think funding is obviously a big and obvious one, but it won't totally address it, because there's still barriers that are, as you say, institutional in terms of career incentives for doing really integrative, interdisciplinary work. Sometimes that's just not rewarded in some of the areas we work with. And then it's also a matter of training people to be flexible and be curious about different epistemologies, and try to see how another field or discipline might approach a problem. And there's efforts to do this, but we need to ramp it up with the same urgency as we have with facing the climate challenge, really. I wish we had 50 years to figure out how to do interdisciplinary socio-ecological science, but we've got to do it now. So I think that we have seen some positive efforts from funding agencies around the world, and it's on all of us to call for more of it.
Roger, I know you've thought about this social science area, as we prepared this roadmap, you were really a powerful voice for the importance of these issues. I know you've done some work on this in California. Just any reflections on your part in terms of social science research? I know your training is as a scientist, physical scientist, not a social scientist, but I wonder if you have any thoughts or insights from your perspective on this.
Yes, that my knowledge of this came because I had the opportunity to work closely with social scientists, including Holly, and to learn about the issues and to understand what needs to be done. And frankly, that has not happened. The engineering and geology, we don't sit down with social scientists very often, and when we do, it's cursory, it's lunch or something. And I encourage the governments and research institutions of the world to create forums where these fields have to work together, have to understand what's important to each other, and are encouraged to find the joint space that we heard today. And that's a thing that can be done, but it just takes time between people talking.
Right. Well, we have a very interesting question from Dr. Atsushi Kurosawa, who is one of the leading energy experts in Japan. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Kurosawa, in this session. And he writes, biological carbon rotation period is relatively short compared to geological ones, which is a key point. Economic valuation or labeling policy schemes are required for incentives. Does anyone have any thoughts in reaction to that?
So I can jump in
Dan.
a little bit. Yeah,
Great.
Thank you, Julio. I think part of this difference in the carbon cycle, the rotation of the time it takes to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it into the biosphere, and the time that it takes to release carbon from the geosphere into the atmosphere, is one reason why we think we can use biomass to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. I think that's a promise, but as mentioned in Dr. Kurosawa's question, use phases for things like buildings or biochar or other durable products is not as strong as storage in geologic formations. So I think in the end, you ultimately do need quantitative metrics to compare the relative carbon storage of different products in order to set proper incentives here.
Exactly. Just to add a little bit to that, the short carbon cycle times in the biosphere are a feature. It allows one to think of this whole system, or BICRS, as a conveyor belt in which atmospheric CO2 is transferred to the subsurface. To make sure that we have good outcomes, though, and in order to get the financing and the money for the incentives, you need to do the life cycle work. You need to do the techno-economic analysis. And we have to make sure this is done in a just, valid way that is sustainable.
Thoughts? We have another question. Says, it seems, it's a statement really, it seems that there are possibly technical issues as well if you try to solve institutional and political ones. That's interesting. Julio, what do you think about that?
Completely agree. It was part of the reason why we focused on things like the satellite monitoring. At the technology that we have today, the combination of AI and microsatellites and imaging allows one to do a high level of sophisticated technical work that will enable standards and policies and markets. Similarly, if you have, and this is a bit to Dr. Kurosawa's point too, If you have a market where you are shipping CO2 or shipping biomass or shipping hydrogen or shipping some other product, then the technical issues around, again, the life cycle, the land use, are important from institutional perspectives, but also important from a market perspective. One of the recommendations we made in the report is that groups of countries set a standard to purchase BICRS. In order to do that, they have to have the technical information to get it done. And they have to have secure supply chains, which are additional technical issues. They have to have good monitoring policies for the subsurface. They have to have a clear understanding of durable carbon in products like cement or buildings or the deep ocean. All of those are technical challenges which will affect the institutional and operational questions.
So we're coming down to our last few minutes here. One thing I want to do is ask again any of my co-authors if somebody would like to just explain why we recommend changing the terminology from BECCS to BICRS. It's something we said at the beginning, but I think the audience who's new to this might appreciate kind of hearing that rationale again. And then I want to go around and give everybody just a 30 seconds or 45 seconds to state one point that they hope the audience will take away from this conversation. I think I will, when I do that, I'm gonna start with Holly and then go on, I don't know if everyone has the same order on their screen, but we'll go in the order that I see it anyway. Before I do that, I just wanna mention that there's one chapter in the roadmap that we have fun writing, which is we imagine a speech in the year 2050 that might be given at the climate conference of the parties in 2050 once the world has reached net zero emissions, and BICRS has played a role in that. And we try to use that ideal vision to think about what could this be like if it all works out well at the end of the day. And so if you're interested in this topic, I recommend going and taking a look at that speech and see whether you think we're dreaming or whether this is a vision that's worth pursuing. Anybody want to volunteer to explain why we go from BECCS to BICRS? Roger, it's yours.
The world has a limited amount of biomass available. And the question is, what are we going to use it for? Of course, we use it for food, we use it for agriculture, but in climate terms, where's its greatest value? And because it's half carbon, it turns out that its greatest value is in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the energy that you get is basically a side product and can add value. But first of all, you want to maximize the amount of carbon dioxide you remove from the atmosphere by this process in which Mother Nature has already done half the work for us. So that's why we moved from BECCS to BICRS.
Great. All right, I think we've each got about 30 seconds to one key takeaway point. Holly, what are your thoughts?
I just want to highlight the final recommendation of the report, which is that a set of nations and companies lead development of the frameworks, methodologies, and standards that must underlie gigaton scale BICRS. It's so important that we have an international effort on this, and I hope to see it.
Thank you so much. Julio.
There's now a voluntary market for CO2 removal, and the voluntary market's large. And people are paying between $50 and $200 a ton to remove CO2. One of the reasons we started on BICRS is because there's innovation in business. There's a company that just is basically taking biomass, converting it to oil, and putting that underground. And that's a business now. That kind of future awaits us, and we've only just begun exploring it.
All right, we've got maybe 15 seconds apiece for some top line comments here. Roger.
Opportunity for everybody in the world to participate in this and have a positive impact on both the climate and their own economy is a really key issue.
Thank you. Dan.
Great. I think there's a huge opportunity in the short term to use biomass to produce carbon negative fuels, whether gaseous or liquid. I think it's going to be an important part of how we start to use biomass. And I think it's an industry that is ready to scale.
Colin.
We've talked a lot about the importance of life cycle analysis and monitoring. We have the technologies to do that and make those measurements, but we need to integrate that at the systems level with good policy, making good policy and implementing good policy.
Oh, and that was going to be my takeaway. So I'll just repeat it. Two of us called that. I think we haven't talked much about it in this hour, but I think policy is absolutely central to getting this done right, and it's going to be really key. And with that, we're at the top of the hour. I want to once again thank all of the hard work that went into this from the ICEF team in Tokyo, and thank you so much for hosting us. Have a good day in Tokyo. Have a good afternoon and evening around the world. Thank you so much.